Well, hey, we're going to dive back into our margins series. I think, looking around the room, most of us have been here at least once or twice. I don't have to go into a lot of description, but we're basically still doing the same thing. We're looking at God's best in these different areas that Paul is talking about with the church of Corinth that we still deal with today. Each person is being invited to kind of look at where are you now in that particular area. And again, my hope and my prayer is that you're keeping track of these. We talked about this a couple times over. We gave you paper, if you're using a journal, if you're using your iPad, if you're using your phone, whatever the case may be. There's a reason we're defining these margins. It's a starting point, or a fresh starting point to look at discipleship in each of our lives and us as a church of how we grow in Christ, or to be more like Christ. So if we're talking about God's best in these different areas, and where you are now, that this middle area is what we're defining as the margin. And if you can grab this margin of, okay, what do I need to do to get here, then you have a defined area that you can work on, that you can look at, that God can work with you on. Maybe you want to get into the Bible and study on, or some things you want to look at. And again, we talked about multiple topics. And a lot of the topics that we talked about, I'm not sure if you noticed, if we've come across something here in Corinthians, we always try to go for like the root cause of it, like when we were first talking about, I have an example in mind, but it's not necessarily the one I want to use because it kind of tramples on today. But if we're looking at something like the young man who is having an affair with his stepmother, at least we hope it's stepmother. It doesn't really imply if it's biological mother or stepmother. We didn't necessarily talk about that as much as the root cause of that, which is the church dealing with sin and how we deal with sin. So we've been going deeper into it. However, today, using that same general idea, we're going into a section where Paul's talking about sexual immorality. And on this one, that's exactly what we want to talk about. That's exactly what we want to dig into. Because I would say, as much as there is with us worshiping some of the things that are on our schedule and worshiping some of the stuff when it comes to finances, sexual immorality is definitely one of the biggest idols that we can have in our lives, and one of the biggest ones that we can struggle, one of the biggest ones that we can justify, and one of the biggest ones that impacts us in major ways. So I want to just kind of hit it direct and dig into it. I want to look at what Paul has to say. So if you will go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, I'll put that up on screen for you. I want to look at what he has to say. It's another one of those paragraphs where it's chock full of nuts, so we're going to kind of have to dissect it apart a little bit and see what he has. And then I want to go through and really kind of define what sexual immorality is with examples, because it's one of those things that I think some of us are doing some things we don't even realize fall into this category. And so it's good to kind of put them out there, draw into them to see what we're doing between where we're at now and God's best for our lives and what he calls us to. And I do want to be cautious about that, because God's best sounds like, oh, yeah, that would be best, but God's best is what he calls us to, and anything under that is bondage, and anything under that is sin. So I don't want to downplay it either. But we are going for what God calls us to and what we find within the Word. So let's start out just by reading this section, and then we'll start breaking it apart. But I'm going to start out in verse 12. Paul is writing to them. You'll notice he puts this in quotations. He says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food. And God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord, and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexual and immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, for whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. Now, there's a couple of different things that we can bring out of this scripture, but that all kind of goes in together. For instance, the first thing that kind of stands out is Paul is telling us that liberty is good, but there's a limit to liberty. When it comes to freedom, there's a limit to freedom. And let me talk about that a little bit, because if you think about what it was like for these guys in the early church, when they have been used to centuries and thousands of years of the Old Testament way of do this, don't do this, do this, do that, here's these sacrifices, here's these rituals, this is how you clean, all of a sudden you're unclean, now you got to go back in. All of a sudden when Jesus fulfilled all that, and so that when you accept Jesus as leader and forgiver in your life, and again, this is the most important part of the sermon every week. When you accept Jesus as leader and forgiver in your life by acknowledging with your mouth he's the Son of God, you're God, I'm not, believe in your heart he died and rose again, and say, I'm following you, and actually follow him, and actually sacrifice the life that you want back to the one who created it and purposed it correctly. So once you have that, they didn't have all these rituals and sacrifices because Jesus was that ritual, and Jesus was that ritual. And now there's a lot of freedom. And now, also on the other side of things, God has now revealed the beauty of the quote-unquote secret, that it's for the Gentiles as well as the Jews. So now for Gentiles, there's a lot of freedom because they're not stopped at the outer court anymore. They're part of the body. And when we have mercy and we have grace, there's a couple of different ways that can roll. For some, and this includes today, obviously, there could be, I've got mercy and grace, so I'm going to heaven, and that's all the more they think about it. They kind of forget that we're actually supposed to be following. And so, yeah, I know I shouldn't be doing this, this, and this, but God will forgive me. Oh, I'm so thankful God is patient with me. You remember we've talked about that a lot. But these guys are kind of dealing with it from a different standpoint. They're looking at, look at how much God's given us. I just want to partake. And I just want to go crazy with it. And so Paul starts talking to them about some of the phrases, and I'm probably going to skip this part on the PowerPoint, but some of the phrases they use so that you see in these quotations. In other words, when he sees these quotations, he says, I've heard you guys say this, and that you're living by this, but this is not really realistic. All things are lawful for me, and food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food, and I'm going to partake. The easiest way to kind of rectify this is by looking at the example of food, because it seems weird that he's thrown in the stomach and all that kind of stuff when it comes to sex. But he's got something he's setting up, because they kind of understand it when it comes to food easier than when it comes to sexual purity. When they were going through this time, for a long period of time, they couldn't eat certain types of food. Do you remember this? There's certain types of food that they considered good, certain kinds they could consider bad that they couldn't eat, until one glorious day, Peter's up on the roof of Simon the tanner's house, and God gives him a vision. Do you remember? And all this blanket comes down filled with all these animals and goes back up, and God keeps saying to him, don't say what I've made is bad. It is all good. And so they've been, the deeper purpose had to do with Gentiles and Jews, but it also opened up the door that they could eat any kind of food they wanted to. And Peter had to have it, I think, 3 times, because he was so rooted in the way that he was raised in his tradition that he had to have it multiple times for God to kind of get through to him. Now, I know in the Bible, the next thing that happens is Cornelius' men show up, and they say, can you come with us? And he goes, preaches to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles get the Holy Spirit for the very first time. Very powerful story all the way through. But somewhere in my imagination, on the way to Cornelius' house, Peter stops by City Barbecue, and he gets a pulled pork sandwich, and he's got the barbecue sauce, and I thought, oh, it's so good. I like City Barbecue. Anybody else like City? It doesn't matter. Okay, so, and if he did, that's okay now. It wasn't that morning, but it's okay now because that door is open. And so there's freedom and there's liberty. But if Peter started going to City Barbecue for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and kept buying that $23 massive plate with 5 different meats and all the fixings, he's going to start having some issues. Issues they never dealt with the kind of eating that they did at that time. And he's going to become sluggish, and he's going to become diabetic, and he's going to have different challenges going on, right? That will go within it. And so here's Paul using this as kind of an example. You're free to eat, but if you become gluttoned, there's going to be some things that come with that. It's not a good thing. It's free, but it's limited. And he's going to use that same type of mentality when it comes to sex. Because God gave us sex, and it's pleasurable. And a lot of people here were saying, well, if God gave it to me, I'm going to partake, whether or not it's healthy or whether or not it's within the right guidelines. So let's talk just a couple seconds Oh, Ving. Yeah, I'll stay black. Okay. For God's best, we could do a pretty lengthy Bible study about that, but I think for the most part, we know, and this is going to be a place word for now. I'm going to change that word in here at the end, but if I if I remember and the Spirit doesn't go someplace else. But for now, God's best is purity, sexual purity. And without doing a big study, I think most of us would agree, and maybe you don't, and you're allowed to not agree. And if you want to have coffee with me sometime this week and talk it through, I'm thrilled to do that. I love having conversations with people. And I'll listen to all the details and I'll throw out details, but at the end, just I want to let you know I'm going to always go back to the Word, and the Word wins for me. So, but I understand there's some complexities. But for the most part, we understand that purity is that sex was created for a man and a woman who are in a committed, married relationship that love each other and love the Lord. You with me? Man, woman, married, committed, mature, both love the Lord, love each other. Because you can be married and still abuse your spouse sexually. You can still fall out of this. It's not just the marriage bed. There's a lot within that. So that's what God has driven us for. That is what He's designed us for. And the reason He's designed us for that, and that system for us, is because He loves us. Because when we step out of this, it does cause hurt to His children. And it causes pain to His children. For instance, I mean, just throwing some things out, if we were going to look at statistics when it comes to STDs, okay, just within the world or the country or however we want to look at it, I guarantee you that if everybody embraced God's plans, those numbers would drop significantly, hugely. Because God didn't want us to have to deal with that. And I'm not just talking about something we had to go get an ointment and about 12 hours later everything's okay. I'm talking about things that people carry for decades, that they will carry until the time of their death. He doesn't want that for you. And you can say, well, you know, I practice safe sex. Just real quick, and you can hate me for this, there is no such thing as safe sex. There's not. There's safer sex, but there's no such thing as safe sex. A condom doesn't do what abstinence does. It just doesn't. So that's something that God doesn't want for your life that sometimes that we embrace. If you look at, let's say, Voice of Hope, we love working with Voice of Hope. Barbara's been here and spoke many times. Next month, the care team is going to be leading a kind of a collection, change collection. We've done the baby bottle collections before. They do a lot of great, loving, truthful work with young women who find themselves with unexpected pregnancies, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. If everybody followed this, they'd be out of business. God never intended for a young woman or a young man who finds himself in the same place, and hopefully he stands by her. God just never intended for kids to have to go through that before they're ready. And my oldest son was born when his mama was 16. So I'm not talking without emotion here. I'm just saying God never intended us for that kind of stress, that kind of pain, those things that you go through. A bunch of wonderful kids have come to us through this. God does great things, but that's not what He is intended for. And this would have really protected a lot of hearts, protected a lot of lives, and maybe set them up on a little bit of a stronger foundation. Are you still rolling with me? There's a lot of reasons. And one of the crazy things is why a condom might help with those two things a little bit. The one thing we never talk about is when we have intercourse with somebody, we join with them. This is what Paul's talking about. He goes, two bodies become one. And Jenny's okay with me talking about that, so I talk about this a lot, not a lot, like every week. Let's talk about Tom's sex life. Come on in. It's okay, you'd be done 5 minutes later. Anyway, no, I'm kidding. That was bad. Facebook Live is not working, right? This is just in-house? Okay. Good. Woo! Anyways, when we got married, my wife entered into our marriage in purity. She waited for marriage. I did not. And I made several mistakes in my 20s, especially in that area. And one of the things that no one ever prepared me for is that you join with that person and something is gone from you that you've given to that person. and vice versa. And I remember the first time I was 18, first time I was with somebody, and I truly felt I loved her. I truly thought we were going to get married. We've known each other since we were knee-high, very committed. We ended up having relations with each other a few times, and I can tell you the night that she called and she's dealing with the guilt and the emotions from it and broke off our relationship, the only time that I remember that deep of a darkness in my heart was when my first wife said she was leaving. It takes something from you that nothing else can protect. When that person walks away from you, when you walk away from them, and I would even say, because I walked this path, when you get to the point that you're so jaded that you can justify a one-night stand, it still takes something from you. It's something God never intended. And so what I'm saying more than anything else is when my fiance was giving me purity, it broke my heart not to be able to do the same back for her. When we stick with God's plan, there's a reason for it. It's made for one man, one woman who are mature, that are married, that are committed, that love each other and love the Lord. Sexual immorality is anything outside of that. Are we still good? We still all together on the same page? So while God's given us sex, it's limited in its liberty for our betterment, for our good. I know a lot of us have had different paths and different challenges from that, but I think we can all agree for the most part with this section of things. So that's kind of our starting point. That's kind of our high bar. That's what God commands, and He has His reasons to command it into our lives. But I want to talk about situations that are sexual immorality so we make sure that we're defining these correctly together, because liberty does, again, extend to sexual immorality. Now, if you remember correctly, if you've been with the study, you'll remember we've already come against this. I talked about a few minutes ago where they had a problem in their church where somebody was having sexual relations with, again, either their stepmom or their biological mother. I think when we went over that, we all pretty much agreed that that was an ooh, right? That's yucky. I don't think anybody in the house was like, sure. It was yucky. And there are things within sexual immorality that I think for the most part that everybody agrees is in that ooh factor. And that's why they should be dealing with it. So when we're talking about incest, obviously that's sexual immorality. When we're talking about something within the family, something along those lines, that is something that's not okay. I don't think I need to overly preach on it. I will say that if you have experienced it in the area, especially of sexual abuse, maybe you've raised in a way where an abuser convinced you that it was okay and it was good, and that's how you show love to one another. If you need to talk to somebody and you need help with that, the door's wide open. I mean, we love you. If you've done it to somebody else, the door's wide open, and we'll get you some help. And if it's something that needs to be reported to protect somebody now, we will report it, but we'll stand with you, and we'll love on you and help you get the help that you need, because it's not right, it's not okay. I think we all can agree that sex trade is not okay, where women are being kidnapped and forced into the sex trade and moved around the country and beyond. I'm not sure if you realize, I believe Ohio is in the top 5 states when it comes to sex trade, of people being kidnapped and people being taken. I just read a story just even this morning of somebody in Columbus in their 30s was going into Myers and was grabbed by 2 men, and she ended up fighting her way out, but they didn't want her car, they didn't want her purse. It was they were taken. I remember a story that reminds me why I'm an overprotective father, of a teenage girl that went to Polaris with her mom, and the teenage girl decided she needed to go to the restroom. And not too long later, mom's standing there, and 2 ladies are dragging her daughter out who is obviously drugged. And she says, "Excuse me, what's going on?" They're like, "Oh, this is our daughter. She's been drinking, and we got to get her help." She's like, "Oh, it's my daughter." And thankfully, mom was there to be able to take care of her. Obviously, child abuse. We're going to, I think, agree on that. Just got done watching Leaving Neverland, the one with 2 people accusing Michael Jackson on HBO, 4-hour documentary. And it really shows whether or not you believe them. It's not part of the sermon today, but it definitely does show how the manipulation and how the lies and how the shaping works when it comes to that. I think all of us would agree that rape is on the yuck factor. It's not okay to force yourself onto someone else. I think a lot of times when we think of rape, we think of like somebody in a back alley dragging somebody behind a dumpster. Rape is also when you're dating somebody and they say no, and you decide to plow through. Anybody for bestiality? I don't think so. No? If you are, talk to Monica. She would love to help you out. But I'm telling you, there's some messed up things in this world. There's some messed up things in our community. I've seen things come across where there's lawsuits where people are trying to marry their cat, marry their dog. I saw a dolphin, and I've seen a goat. And some of that is for weird political statements, and some of it's for something worse. I've seen situations where people have been forced within different cultures to marry the animal because they've already had relations with the animal, and that was part of the punishment and making it right. And I think that most of us would agree that swinging is not. So I'm not saying slinging. Don't mess up everybody's TV programs. But swinging's pretty messed up. But I'll tell you what, I have seen a news story about a husband and wife that their ministry is being Christian swingers. And how do you reach sinners? You go and be with them and do the exact same thing that they're doing, and they're using swinging as an outreach, and may God bless them and tear them down. Okay, so I think for the most part, when the yuck things, we kind of agree on them pretty quickly. But is yuck really the guideline that we go by? Because just because something might not be attractive to you does not necessarily mean that it's sin or sexual immorality. Let me give you one that I'm not making a statement on either side. It's not the point of the sermon, but I do want to push us just a little bit. This past week, there was an article that went out that went on several different people's Facebook messages, and the predominant comments are always yuck. We'll go ahead and put up the post if you would, Sarah. Appreciate your help. So you may have seen this, you may have not. Different people have had different reactions to it about first cousins getting married. This is a couple that live in Utah. They have been married, both been married before. They both have been single. They decided to get married. I don't think he has kids. She has a couple of kids already from the first marriage. And again, predominantly, I would say, what I've seen, I don't know about in this room, it'd be an ew. It'd be a yuck. Because we've generally been raised that you don't marry your first cousins. Does that make it a sin? You with me? You still like? We have to think about it a little bit. Is this something that's not the social norm? Or is this something that God would say no to? I've been raised where cousins don't marry because what? When they have babies, they have 3 heads, right? I mean, that's why the law is there in most of the states. Not all states have it illegal for you to marry first cousins. Matter of fact, they drove from Utah to Colorado to get married and go back home. The reason why that's there is because for first cousins to get married, they share 12.5% of their DNA, which means that they have, I think it's a 4 to 7% chance of having a child with deformities, which is lower than what I would have thought it was, right? Because the average person, they have, I think it's a 3 to 5% chance. If you marry somebody that you're not related to at all or far out, I'd have to bring John up because he knows how these trees work better than I do, and ancestry and all that type of things. But no, seriously, he's really good. If you ever want to have any questions, he'll tell you the history of this town without even blinking. But it's not that much more of a margin, but it is a margin, but it is something that's kind of a social accessibility. So we want to make sure that we're keeping our gauge here, not just on the stuff that we think is gross or yucky, but the things that this world is starting to embrace. The things that we in the church are starting to embrace. The things that several of us embrace. We might call it struggling with, but don't see it at such a level that we are going to fight against it, give it to God, and to sacrifice into it. And that's where we're going to find our margin. So let me talk about some of the things that we say, well, if it's between 2 consenting adults, or if it's behind closed doors, it's not my business, or I'm fine doing it as long as everybody's participating and whatnot. And since we're in church, someone might be thinking, oh, okay, now he's getting ready to start talking about homosexuality. And realistically, again, homosexuality does not fit into the biblical commandment of purity as far as same-gender sex. Again, that's a whole other conversation as far as temptation and attraction and when does it become sin and how do we work and what's contentment, those type of things. I'd love to have coffee with you on that. I've shared many times. I've preached on that topic once. It was an hour-long sermon. It's still available for you to check out. I think it's had over 800 views so far because of the topic itself. I don't like it being a sermon. I like it being a conversation because I understand how emotional it is and the complexities that's within it. But yes, that would, same-gender sex would fall under sexual immorality, but so does fornication. And we need to make sure that we're keeping everything on the same page. If you don't know what fornication is, it's sex outside marriage. That's what it's defined as, the sex outside marriage. And part of the challenge that we have with reaching people outside is like, oh, you're always down on the LGBTQ, and there's now a couple more letters, community, but you never look in-house. So let's look in-house. First off, if we look in-house, we're going to find that there's been plenty of times that we've had gay couples and gay people within our church and active within our church. And I think most of us would be uncomfortable walking in, not most of us, many of us would be uncomfortable walking in and seeing a gay couple and identifying with them and maybe even communicating with them. You guys are pretty good at it, but nonetheless, that would raise our flag a little bit faster than the people who are in our midst that are living together, that are having sex with one another, and they're not married. Do you see how we can become more comfortable with some things over other things? And that's predominantly getting even bigger and bigger. And the concern is not, I want you to agree with me or I want to judge your sin bigger than my sin. The concern is either one of those platforms, you're not at God's best. So let's talk about where we're at and how to get there. Both of those are sexual immorality, things that we need to dig into. In all honesty, some of you guys would probably think, why wasn't this just on the yuck side? But I think this is becoming more and more prominent, and I think within the next 10 years we're going to see a lot more legislation about this and a lot more normalizing polygamy. You know, like, there's a reason why Big Love was a big show on HBO. There's a reason why people are watching Sister Love. So we have such a strong mentality that as long as everybody's consenting adult, it doesn't matter. I think that's something that's going to come up more and more. And you're going to could say, well, wait, if I look at King David, if I look at Solomon, what I'm talking about is what God called us to, and I'm telling you this now. You get into the Bible, you're going to see much more sexual immorality than David messing up when it comes to multiple wives. You're going to see some real messed up stuff in the Bible because people sin. And the Bible doesn't try to whitewash everything. And so just because David did it, he's a great king, one after God's heart, doesn't mean that that he was following God's best for his life. Strip clubs, I think some more people justify than what they are. I'm not doing anything. I'm not really touching anybody. I'm just kind of watching. It's sexual immorality. Prostitution, I think, is becoming more and more normalized than sex slave. We think sex slave, we say yuck. We say prostitution. Well, everybody's an adult. I mean, I just saw something not too long ago when they were talking about this guy that owns the Patriots, and with him getting busted going to that massage parlor down in Florida. And I saw a reporter, a young lady, saying, like, you know, I really learned a lot when it comes to prostitution by being in Las Vegas and meeting these girls. He doesn't need to do that. Everybody's concerned, don't just go prostitution. She goes, I used to think it was wrong, but now they're just doing it in a living. You get into the statistics of what's going on behind the people that are in prostitution, even with legal prostitution, it's pretty messed up. And even if it wasn't, not that. It's not that. Sending naked pictures of one another is becoming much more of a trend, not just with our teens, but within our adults as well. It's not God's best. You're sharing something, even if it's not in the physical, with someone that is not your husband. It's not what it's meant for in any way, shape, or form. And once you send it, you lose control of it. And so I think it could be one talk when it comes to youth who are not necessarily thinking through all the repercussions of decisions that they have, nor do adults in many cases. But I see it even becoming more and more prominent within adults. There was an actress not too long ago, got her her account hacked. They took her naked pics and they sent it all over the place over the internet. And she was obviously upset about this. And I absolutely blame the guy who did that. He wouldn't have been able to do that if she was living in purity, but it's absolutely his fault, so don't get me wrong on this at all. But one of my concerns within this was what she said, and she has a lot of young women who follow her, and it just broke my heart. She said, the pictures are mine, They are my boyfriends, and this boyfriend was an actor and she goes, he was working out of the country on this film, and I sent him these pictures because if you don't keep your man sexually happy, he will stray. Listen to me. Guys, gals, whatever it is, if you ever think you have to do something compromising in any way, shape, or form of what God's called you to do, to keep somebody, let them go. That person is so shallow and so selfish. Let them go. Let them go. That is not God's best for you, and it will not be unless Jesus Christ gets a hold of them and they submit to him. And then adultery. Let's go with a couple big ones. Adultery. Let me give you some things when it comes to adultery in the church. I was looking at some things and again, statistics can be used either ways, but just so we have a feel. I saw this one page, it was talking about what is adultery, and it was talking about different things that happen. Does this constitute adultery or not? And so let's say, like, would an ongoing sexual relationship with somebody outside of your spouse, would that be considered adultery? Yay, nay, anybody? Yeah, everybody for the most part? In the U.S., 76% people agree with you. It means 1 out of 4 thinks it's not adultery. I have no idea. Think it's not adultery. Isn't that crazy? I have no idea. You know what's crazier? In the church, if they just Christians, 82% agree. Which means almost 20% of the church thinks that that's not adultery. One night stand, adultery, not adultery? Yeah, those numbers drop a little bit. U.S. 73% agree with you, and 77% of Christians agree with you. If you're having an emotional affair with somebody and you're going further than what you know it's comfortable to be, but you're not physically being sexual with them, affair or not? Half of Americans agree with you. 67% of those in the church agree with you. You see how we start watering things down so easily? Is pornography adultery? 19% of the country agrees with you. 31% of those in the church agree with you. Well, sexual immorality is slipping. It's slipping. If I look at Matthew 5, I don't have the verse off the top of my head, I'm sorry. I don't know if I put it in there or not. I don't think I did. But Jesus has a section where he's talking about within the Sermon on the Mount that when you look on a woman in lust, that you've already done the deed. You remember that? You did in your heart. Now, don't take it like the 31% who would say, well, if I already did it, might as well get the joy out of it. Right? That's not what he's saying. He says that our sin comes from our heart. And he's not saying if you're walking down the mall, you look at someone and go, wow, she's pretty attractive, that you lusted and now you had an adulterous affair. But it does say that we have to be really serious about where we're at when it comes to our purity, when it comes to the Lord. Let's talk about pornography since it's on the table. In the church, 68% of men struggle with pornography. 33% of women struggle with pornography within the church. 76% of our teens are struggling with pornography within the church. Some statistics you might want to think about as far as how serious that problem is becoming. Pornography, there's over 40 million Americans that are regular viewers of pornography. Pornography as an industry makes more money than the NFL, the NBA, and the MLB combined each year. If you don't like sports, let's do this. It makes more money a year than NBC, CBS, and ABC nationally make combined. Porn leads to a 300% increase of a chance of infidelity in your marriage. 56% of divorces involve one partner being obsessed with pornography. Yeah, it's pretty messed up. And I think for those who have slipped into these percentages, you know how hard it is to stop. If you're not struggling with pornography, think about how hard it is maybe to give up cigarettes or how to give up crack cocaine and other areas. It really takes a lot of people down. I know it's one of those areas that I have struggled with over the years. I'm very thankful that God has given a lot of more freedom in this area. And a lot of that comes with accountability. A lot of that comes with honesty to my wife. A lot of that comes with just making new choices. It's a very different picture than it was 15 years ago. But I would say that my story is within that 66% at that time. Go into Dad's office, you find a Playboy or two. In my case, it was my neighbor's dad. Then maybe a year later, you got some friend whose parents use porn as part of their sex life, and so you watch 10 minutes of it, and you're shocked, and you're overwhelmed. And then someday, the internet shows up, and it's free, and it's everywhere. You guys know what I'm talking about? I mean, this is easy. For me, one of the things that helps outside accountability and whatnot is also just, there's a thing called the Circle. It's a box that we have at home by Disney that takes and restricts certain things and whatnot, and putting your devices on it. So even if I run home and we've got to finish this up, because I just want all the safeguards as possible, if you Google anything, like just Google sex, it's going to come up that there's no sex on the internet. Really? There's no sex on the internet? That's pretty cool. That's pretty sweet. But you just can't get to it anymore. We have to look at the things that are impure within our lives as outside God's will, and we have to really root them out. We really need to struggle in with one another. And we got to identify what they are. I remember a young man, and then I'm going to kind of finish things up with some 3 points, but just to show you how this works. And I think you'll kind of find it a little bit comical, but I think if we look at it in our own life, there's a reason we name things out. This young man I've known all of his life. When he was in high school and just graduated, he was not with the Lord. His mom was a church-going Christian lady, was really concerned about it. We got him to go on a Christian retreat with us, and he ended up coming to know Jesus as leader and forgiver in his life, which was awesome and great. And then we also entered into some mentorship like you do with people that are starting out. And I remember him and I sitting and talking, and we started talking about sex. And when I was talking about sex being a sin, his face went white. I mean, his face just dropped. He's like, wait a minute. Sex is a sin outside of marriage? Yeah. He's like, dude, me and my girlfriend are having sex at least 7 times a day. Yeah. Right? First off, in your worldliness, you're like, wow. Stanima, got it. But yeah, dude, that's not of God. And why it's a little funny right now, it's many years later, and he's married, and he has kids, and he wished he never had that connection with that young lady, and he saved it for his wife. Because God wants our best, and he wants his best in our lives with it. So let me just throw out some points, some things to think about that Paul is talking about here that helps us in these areas, because I really don't care what age you are, if you're married or you're not married. There's some areas I think that God is speaking to today. And the first point that he brings up is this, and he makes it very, very clear. Your body belongs to God. And I've seen people use these scriptures to motivate themselves as far as working out. And that's great, but it's not really the context of what he's talking about here. He says you've been paid for with a price. What is that price? It's the blood of Christ. You belong to him. And the 3 people that need to be in your sex life is you, your spouse, and God. That our sex life really, as far as any kind of connection, any kind of intimacy, is an extension of our intimacy and our connection with God. And we belong to him. And so that alone can maybe help us a little bit with some of these low-ball ways of thinking that we have to go forward when we say, I keep making these decisions like it's me, but I belong to him. I think I kind of changes some things, at least for me, on how some of these things can fall together. The 2 becoming one flesh with God being involved within it. One of the things I always like, and I talk about this in marriage counseling a lot of times, just to encourage you, because if you're not married yet, boy, make sure you're really careful on who you partner with. But if you and your spouse in all areas, including sexual immorality, are growing to be closer to God, then you guys are growing closer together. Amen? I mean, that's just a simple fact. What you don't want is you trying to be closer to God and your spouse is focused on making sure that you've got a financial future, because you're already heading 2 different directions. And what's even worse is if you don't care about God as much as you do your kids, so you're focused on family, they're focused on money, and you're headed to divorce. Being focused on God and having that intimacy, you are his, your spouse, I pray, has that same understanding, and that gauges how your sex life is with one another. The second one that kind of threw out to me was flee from sexual immorality. And I want you to put a real focus on the word flee. That literally is probably the best word for it. When you put your computer into a Disney circle box, it's because you're fleeing, because you don't want that temptation in the middle of the night when everybody else is in bed. It goes back to Joseph, when Joseph was sold into slavery and he was raised up in Potiphar's house. If you know this story, if not, just kind of follow along a little bit. But he was raised up as the head slave, Potiphar's house, and then his wife thought he looked pretty hot. And so when Potiphar was gone, she tried to drag him into bed. What did Joseph do? He let go of the coat and he took off. I cannot be here. He didn't do that because he was so timid and scared that woman freaked him out. He did it because he was tempted, and the only option is get out of here. What ways, look at that sexual immorality and what things trigger that you know that when this happens or this happens, I'm heading down the wrong path, and make new decisions. Have people involved, whatever case may be, whatever it takes to flee from sexual immorality. And the biggest one, I think, is this: don't forget that you are his beloved. Don't forget that you're his beloved. And that's the word I want to put here instead of purity. Because purity should be just a byproduct of the fact that I'm his. And he is mine. And I'm in an intimate relationship with him. When we look at the Hebrew words, there are two words that bring up the definition of beloved. One means to breathe, and the other means to long for. And that's how he sees you. And that's how he calls us to see him. I mentioned earlier, I did have a marriage before that my wife left, and I've talked about it at different times at different seasons. And we had two different goals. I was going towards God, and she was trying to play the part to keep me happy, but she had a different goal in mind. I've been married to my wife for 19 years, where we both had the same goal. It's night and day. So look at all these options and what is bringing in God into your relationship, as well as his purity as being part of his beloved. Hey, listen, I've been reading from some different books, and I'll finish up with this. This one is from The Real God by Chip Ingram. And some of you guys might remember the book. I've talked about it before, but I just wanted to share something that I found in this week, and I pray as an encouragement for you on rethinking some of the decisions that maybe you're making in your sexual life and where you go from there. Let me just read this to you. It says, there are more than 7 billion people in the world who are desperate for love, who were created for it. And on the other hand, there's a God with limitless resources who wants to love them. But the two hands are often far apart. The average person is not experiencing God's love. Imagine a vast crowd representing the entire population of the globe, North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, gathered in one place, standing shoulder to shoulder. And for that moment, all the basic needs have been supplied for: air, food, water. Now imagine that instead of the oceans and lakes being filled with water, they are brimming with liquid love. Every stream, pond, and river holds it, while the countless multitude stands oblivious to it. The depths of love, plentiful and ready for the taking, are within its reach. But somehow there's no connection between the need and the supply. That's the world's predicament. There are still some people who haven't experienced the love of God because they don't even know it's available. They don't know God loves them because no one has ever showed his love to them. They would embrace it if they were aware of it, but tragically they aren't. Imagine a landlocked person who has never seen the ocean. Maybe he's heard about it, but the words he has heard haven't captured it. What would he think when he finally saw it? It would blow his mind, wouldn't it? That's the situation of billions of people in this world that never recognize God's love, and it would blow their minds if they did. Many people know about God's love that have visited that ocean, but they haven't yet received it. Maybe they stood on the shore and they've been told there's God's love. They may even believe that God loves them, but it makes no difference than the idea of another stranger loving them. They've never jumped into the water. They've never immersed themselves in it. They've never discovered that the water of God's love is sweet and satisfies the soul like nothing else. And then there's a third group, a group who knows about God's love and has even been in the ocean, They dove in, they received a generous washing and drink from God's love, but they climbed back out and continued living as if God's love didn't make a lasting difference. They seem to think that they aren't allowed to keep visiting the beach. They have such emotional baggage and memories that they find it difficult to believe God's love is unconditional, is sacrificial, is giving, and is totally apart from their performance. They get his love mixed up with how their parents loved them or how someone else loved them, and they just can't figure out on a daily basis how to experience a supernatural kind of love. One noted Christian author, speaking about the problem some Christians have of receiving God's love, wrote this: "Over the years, I've come to realize that the greatest trap in our life is not success, popularity, power, but it's self-rejection. Success, popularity, and power can indeed present a great temptation, but their seductive quality often comes from the way they are part of the much larger temptation to self-rejection. When we have come to believe in the voices that call us worthless and unlovable, then success, popularity, and power are easily perceived as attractive solutions. The real trap, however, is self-rejection. Self-rejection is the greatest enemy of the spiritual life because it contradicts the sacred voice that calls us the beloved. Being the beloved constitutes the core truth of our existence. If you don't know he's your beloved, you're going to look for cheap substitutes. If you don't know, you don't feel, and you don't embrace that you are his beloved, that he longs for you and he breathes for you, then you're looking for cheap substitutes. And do you know who offers them? Satan glory. It will hurt you in the long run. It will leave you feeling empty. It will mask up the guilt. And it will make you feel like you're not worthy to go to the beach and dive into the ocean. Your daddy has better for you. Much better for you. The biggest mistake that youth leaders made in my life when it comes to sexual purity, or that I had in my life for not taking my own responsibility, or that others, mentors, had in my life, is that I was taught it was a one-time thing. And once I messed up, I was dirty. It was Old Testament thinking. Once I messed up, I was dirty. And do you know why I made the other mistakes I had? I've already messed up. What's the difference now? What your beloved says to you is, I've got mercy and grace right here to pour over you. And I will fight that fight with you. I will give you a new foundation. I will give you a new purity, and you are mine, and I love you. So if any of these things are coming to hit home, and God forbid you feel some guilt, please always know this: guilt is only an invitation to his grace. It's not a place where we live. It is a longing of our heart to be right again, and Jesus right in front of you with his arms open wide, saying, I'm right here.